and make sure I hit the, okay. So Tracy, it's so exciting to talk to you about topics that people don't want to talk about, but they need to talk about, such as end of life care and all those discussions. And I know that the last times that I've spoken with my family members, I've asked them about where's the life insurance policy? What do I do when something happens to you? Not if, but when, because man is born of a woman shall surely die. So I've been trying to figure out, how to have those conversations. And I know that with your work, you see this all the time. But before I get too far, can you introduce yourself and tell everyone what you do?
Absolutely. I'm so glad to talk with you and everyone else on these important and sometimes uncomfortable topics. So I am Tracy Paschke-Johannes, and I'm a chaplain with Hospice of Cincinnati. I've been there about 4 years, and also have an additional 2 years experience with hospice in previous workplaces as well. So I see families in their homes, in nursing home settings, and also in our inpatient unit where we provide acute care at the end of life. So when someone needs 24-hour nursing care, we provide that in our inpatient unit. So I see families in all those different settings, and try to help them with some of these difficult questions.
Oof. And I know you were telling me earlier that, especially with the coronavirus, you've been seeing multiple family members. So I'm sure you've been hearing all types of crazy conversations where people wish that they would have discussed these things sooner. But what types of questions do you suggest that people, should discuss, or what have you heard people say, I wish we would have discussed this before we got to hospice?
Absolutely. And it's a topic that I think is important in any time, but I think it's really come to the forefront during the coronavirus because people are beginning to think a little bit more intentionally about what could happen if I got sick with this illness. But this isn't going to end when we get vaccinated and move forward from coronavirus. We're always going to have that end of life experience and needs.
Yes.
And so those are things that are really important to discuss with family, even though they're uncomfortable. And I think the first thing that you start with is what is important to you at the end of your life. And that isn't just the very end of life, because often doctors and medical care workers won't exactly say, well, this person's going to die in the next, whatever period of time. They might not bring that up initially. There might be discussing more focus on life prolonging treatment. But even in those times, it's important to discuss what's important to you and your family. Is being in your home important to you? That isn't always possible, but that's definitely something that you want to have a conversation about. Would it be important for you to be cared for in the home if that's a possibility for your loved ones? If you needed life prolonging care, would you want care even if it meant that you wouldn't necessarily ultimately survive? I know you've touched on that in some other videos, and that's an important thing to discuss at end of life too, because in our curative medical culture, our life prolonging medical culture, there's always something more that can be done. But the question is it appropriate, and is it going to actually increase your quality of life? So things like, would you want to be placed on a ventilator? Thinking of COVID, if you're talking with an elderly family member, people might always say like, well, I want to do everything that I can. And I want to live if that's possible. Well, does that include being on a ventilator and possibly needing then rehabilitation care if you survive, not being able to care for yourself anymore, having to have someone bathe you and live in a nursing home or another care facility where right now you can't see your family? Is that something to think about and talk about when you start talking about ventilators, for example? Would you want that at all costs? Would you want to do not resuscitate? I think you talked about that previously. Am I right?
No, I'm taking notes now so I can put this in the description box so that people are like, what should I ask? These are the questions.
Yeah. So do not resuscitate order does not mean that somebody's not going to receive care. It does not mean that if you were to come in and you were somebody was having a heart attack, that they would not be receiving any kind of medical care. It simply means if someone's heart stops beating, Does the person want doctors to use CPR, a machine to kind of try to jumpstart the heart, and medications and a ventilator tube down the throat, in order to try to save your life or prolong your life? Something that people often don't know about resuscitation is it was really designed for cardiac arrest, a sudden cardiac arrest out in the community.
Okay.
So someone who's like walking or jogging in the park and they have a sudden cardiac event and collapse. That was the original intent and is fairly effective. I want to be careful not to speak outside my scope as a chaplain, but it's fairly effective in that setting. But when you have somebody that might have, let's say, a metastatic cancer that's spread into their bones or other parts of their body, it really was never designed for that. So if their heart stops beating, it's multiple parts of their body are shutting down. So trying to do CPR, trying to put a ventilator in at that point would not actually be effective, and actually can be very traumatizing for a family to see the person kind of having these things happen at the end of the life, and ends up not even being an effective tool. So something to discuss with families, but then to bring up with doctors too, of, do you think that this is something that I should consider? Kind of have those conversations.
Would you say, Tracy, I'm curious, like from your experience, is having like a living will or a power of healthcare attorney, all those things, like what do you see people have and what do they need?
Yeah, and I think that's great. I think the power of attorney form that you just mentioned is very important, because if you are unconscious or unable to speak for yourself, then that determines who makes medical decisions for you. You've got your healthcare power of attorney, which they decide healthcare decisions, and then financial, which just decides financial. They're not the same. You have to sign and take care of those separately. But I think those are really important, because they not only spark conversation related to those topics, but they start sparking discussion of those, what is important to you in this time? Who would you want to make sure, Clarissa, I want you to call these people if something ever were to happen. I want to make sure that this music is really important to play. If you start looking at those big pictures,
music too, there's so much to think about.
Right. And most people don't, because they're so scared by these big picture things like do not resuscitate or who makes my healthcare decisions. But because you start those conversations, it then starts more conversations. And then people might become a little more comfortable saying, that I want to make sure you call my high school classmate that I was really close friends with. And you might have an opportunity to hear why that person's important in their lives.
So is this documented somewhere? Like, would they document this on a form or something, you mean?
You can. It's more, there are different forms available, and we can put some ideas in the links. There's different resources available. There's your legal documents, which don't include things like what music you want played at the time of your death, but there's other forms as well that have more of those preferences. Some people, they've talked about like a birth plan. Like, I want this kind of music, or I want these people, or I don't want an epidural, or I do, or those kinds of things. It's similar to that, only at end of life. What kinds of things, if possible, would you want to make this experience peaceful? And that helps then not just the person who is experiencing the end of life journey, but it helps their family, because they feel confident that they are making the decisions they know their loved one would want. They aren't left going, I don't know if this is the right thing. I hope I'm making the right decision. And they're left with anxiety and distress, rather than being able to be at the bedside and say, I know this is what she wanted. She told me what was important. I'm very sad that I'm losing her, but I'm also confident that I'm doing what she would want right now. And that feels a sense of purpose, and it decreases kind of some of the spiritual distress that can come at end of life too.
Wow, man. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that level of detail, but all of that is really important. And Tracy, I know that I wanted to be respectful of your time, because we talked about keeping this short so that people would watch it and they would take notes. So thanks again, Tracy. And for more information about how to start this conversation and other resources, we'll put that in the description box. So if you look below this video, you'll be able to see that. And if you want to hear more from Tracy about other ideas, or maybe even a Q&A or something, let me know. Put that in the description, or even comment under this, on the Facebook link for this, and we can figure out what we might be able to do. But thanks,
That'd be
Tracy.
great. Thanks. All right. Have a good day.